Well, thank you. Today we've heard a good deal about the challenges the commercial publishing industry is facing with the digital revolution. At the American Printing House for the Blind, and I'd like to say, first of all, we are not primarily a publisher. We do publish some original works ourselves, but primarily what we've been engaged in since about 1858 is making the materials that you publish available to people who are blind. Now, that's a very small segment of the population. Low incidence, high impact is what it's termed in terms of a disability. Somewhere around about 0.5% to 1% of the population may be blind. We're particularly focused on students because the United States Congress has asked the American Printing House for the Blind to be the primary producer of accessible instructional materials for kids who are K through 12. So I can tell you that we take a census of students in the United States who meet the definition of blindness, and they typically 57,000, 60,000 total students in the U.S. who are blind. So the journal publishing industry, as a rule, has not been going after a market that is complex to serve, costly to serve, and definitely no economies of scale whatsoever. So that's the role of the American Printing House for the Blind. Again, we're a nonprofit, and we are federally funded for some of our work, and otherwise a charitable institution. Digital does not equal accessible is kind of the subtitle, the challenge of accessibility in digital publishing. That's because, we'll get into this in a bit, but one of the common misconceptions that we hear is, well, now that everything's available on an iPad or a Kindle, why do you still need to make Braille? You know, is it everything available for people who are blind? And of course that's absolutely not true, but that's the inspiration for our title today. And we think that the ideal is access for the blind to the same content at the same time, and I guess I would add to that, in the same way. In my experience, and I think the APH's experience, people who are blind would like to be able to just go out to the commercial marketplace and buy the book and be accessible for them at the same time it is for everyone else. And just to share a little background, a little segue into the past, back in the 80s when I was in college, one of my good friends happened to be blind. And I won't talk about her challenges for accessible instructional materials with this, but just I'm assuming that all of you share the love of reading that my friend and I had. We'd like to read a book that was published. We'd like to be able to talk about it. But for me, I would just go to my bookstore, buy my book, and I'd read it. She would have to buy 2 copies of the book, send it off to a prison program where they would record the book for her, and she would get it back in about a year. By then, I would usually have forgotten what I had read, but basically what she can sometimes do now, because of some innovations in the digital arena, from material that's primarily textual in nature, non-fiction books, fiction books that are just basically text. Sometimes today she can actually do that. So that's an incredible achievement, and it's like the digital accessibility offers the potential for almost that kind of, I said, almost the holy grail if you're blind, just to be able to read any book as soon as it's published, just when everyone else is. And for publishers, they would love to buy it from you. But there's still lots of challenges for you guys, and that's where we still come in meeting the needs of that very small, specialized market. But really, it is about, that's what accessibility is all about. Making these materials available, the same content, all of the content, not excluding the images, not including the video, and it's part of the wonderful capabilities of the digital age is to be able to embed in more of those features, but that is just more challenge for you guys to make accessible for a larger population of students with print disabilities, and certainly for those who are blind. So like I said, it sounds simple, but it's really not. We've been working with publishers since the 19th century. You guys have been supportive of us in our efforts to take your materials and make them available exclusively for people who are blind. So we have a long history. But nonetheless, you do have considerations that we consider ethical considerations for the publishing industry in carrying this out. We know that you're experts in publishing, but most of you are not expert in the Braille code, producing tactile graphics, sonification, or any of the techniques for making materials accessible for people who are blind. And also you have to look at your responsibilities to your shareholders if you're a public company, protecting your intellectual property, and other issues that factor into the decisions you make and what to publish, how to publish it, and how you respond to us when we come to you and ask for your rights or your assistance in helping us produce it in an accessible fashion. Generally speaking, the third point, the question of whether it's economically feasible for you to publish the materials yourself to meet the needs of the population, so far has been no. We think that for some materials moving forward, there will be increased possibility, like novels that don't contain images, things like that. There'll be more of the population that you will be able to serve at the same time and on the same basis as the rest of your population through the digital changes we'll talk about in a bit. But for now, there's a large group that will not be served. And as I mentioned, you guys have been working cooperatively with us for a very long time. At APH, we also, accessible media producers. Now, whatever industry you're in, no matter how small it is, you all have your own terminology and jargon, right? Accessible media producers, that just means those who are able to produce accessible formats, and that might be Braille, it might be Daisy Audio, which is a special kind of digital book that's accessible. The NLS books, for example, are in Daisy format, tactile graphics, sonification, image descriptions. If you're producing anything like that, you're an accessible media producer, or AMP. And APH is an accessible media producer. And we have our own issues as well. We're responsible for administering the donated and federal funds responsibly, and that gives us difficult decisions to make sometimes when students come to us and they need a book. It can cost well in excess of $100,000 to transcribe into Braille a single math textbook. And again, we have limited resources. So we have our own ethical challenges as well, how we best use those funds to produce these materials that are so expensive but so critical for the students. So we've struggled with how to best utilize our limited resources to meet the needs of our students and to ensure that our obligations to you and other copyright holders are upheld during this process. So meeting the needs of students who are blind is a joint ethical obligation of APH and of the publishing community. So it's a time of rapid change, as we've been talking about today, in digital content, and that introduces new challenges for both of us. To achieve the goal, given the rapid changes in publishing and the need to keep pace in serving readers who are blind, how far has the market model again is you guys being able to serve them directly, and technological innovations taken us? How much further will they take us in the near future? And what kinds of collaborations will remain essential to providing access to content by readers who are blind? So again, the context, publishing is rapidly moving towards increased digital delivery of content. The market offers a wide variety of content and platforms and devices with varying levels of accessibility. EPUB 3, the new standard that the International Digital Publishing Forum is supporting, and AAP is also supporting for transition to digital publishing, EPUB 3, offers many optional elements to promote accessibility. But how far can those elements go in supporting readers who are blind? And what are the costs of adding in additional features and creating accessible formats? Braille production relies on the cooperative relationships between publishers and accessible media producers. The American Printing House for the Blind is the world's largest nonprofit organization creating educational, workplace, and independent living products and services for people who are visually impaired. The Act to Promote the Education of the Blind made APH the official supplier of K-12 materials in 1879, and that remains the case today. The Association of American Publishers confirms its commitment as well. The AAP has had a long-standing commitment to serving the blind community. AAP works to ensure that children who are blind or visually impaired receive instructional materials in appropriate media. I'm glad to say that AAP and the Serving Students with Disabilities Committee has long supported the creation of accessible materials for people who are blind. They have, in fact, met at APH on more than one occasion over the years. UNESCO, with regard to accessibility in Article 9, we've highlighted, I won't read the whole section to you. I don't have the habit of reading the whole slides because I am also in the habit of presenting to people where a good portion of the audience is blind. So it's a habit that I get into. But anyway, the emphasis here with regard to accessibility, to enable persons with disabilities to live independently and participate fully in all aspects of lives. The bolder part is for information and communications, including information and communications technologies and systems. So at the international level as well, there is a stated commitment to making materials accessible, making information accessible. So how do we meet the ethical obligation? Braille is available, embossed Braille it's called, in hard copy or digital formats using refreshable Braille displays and keyboards. If you have a refreshable Braille display or keyboard, probably none of you do, but if you do happen to have one and you have an iPad, many of you do have one of those, you can actually output Braille from the iPad and connect with your refreshable Braille display. However, the file, the book that you're working from, does need some work done to make sure that you get all the content from that. Tactile graphics, I'll give you an example of that in a little bit. Haptic feedback devices, they've been around for a long time. Many cell phones use haptic displays. It's a way of creating some tactile response that can be very helpful in the digital future in delivering materials for kids who are blind. Screen reading software that generates digital audio or refreshable Braille on the fly as the user is on the computer. So again, the quality of what you're receiving there depends very much on the quality for accessibility that's built into the file that's being accessed and read or delivered through refreshable Braille. And audio versions, both human narrated or digital. Braille equals literacy. So it's very, very expensive to produce Braille. Why is it so important? The access to Braille is a key ethical issue. Braille remains critical for literacy and achievement for students who are blind. Braille is a code, the Braille code. That is how a student who is blind achieves literacy. Some quotes from the National Federation for the Blind. Braille is the only system through which children with profound or total loss of sight can learn to read and write. There is a significant relationship between Braille literacy and academic success, higher income, and employment. Braille literacy skills are just as important for Braille readers as for readers of print. While audio can be an excellent format for recreational content or to supplement Braille, listening is not literacy. I have one colleague who shared his college experience and being given his geometry book in an audio format only. It was not his best grade in college. It's unlikely anyone would seriously suggest getting rid of written instructional materials and substituting audio only for students who are not blind. No one says, why teach children to read and write if they can just listen to the content? If you work in the field of blindness, though, you hear that a lot. This is also not an acceptable alternative, though, for children who are blind. Excuse me. The National Library Service Braille Summit in 2013, that was June of last year. The National Library Service is the arm of the Library of Congress that provides services to people who are blind and certain other print disabilities. They had an national conference about experts together from America and around the world in the first Braille Summit. So they were organized to help pinpoint the issues affecting Braille literacy and develop solutions for addressing them. Karen Kinninger, the director of the NLS, this is her quote regarding literacy. For people who are blind, Braille is the only true form of literacy. So it's probably enough quotes about knowledgeable people who say Braille is literacy, literacy is important, therefore Braille is important. What are the two different kinds of Braille? Basically computer-based Braille or embossed Braille. Hard copy Braille, you have real advantages. You can, as a sighted person, you look at a page and you can rapidly scan it for information, right? A Braille reader can do the same thing. They can read, review, move back and forth. There are real advantages to embossed Braille. Tactile graphics and image descriptions can be provided. I'm going to show you an example of a Braille book with a rudimentary tactile graphic for you. The disadvantages are that it's so time-consuming and costly, and there'll be some other disadvantages you'll see in a moment. Mostly that it's bulky. It takes up a whole lot of space. So there's a Braille page, and you can see a very modest little tactile graphic there showing the reader what an elephant looks like. Okay, I don't know, I cannot read Braille, so I don't know what it says above the elephant, but there's a simple tactographic. We talked about the size. Imagine putting that in your backpack. A biology textbook in embossed braille, 68 volumes. Yes. I have never seen a backpack quite that large. Maybe if you're going up Mount Everest, I don't know. Digital braille. So we talked about the refreshable braille keyboards and displays that allow users to read text from the web or other digital files. Often they use small pens that raise and retract, allowing the user to read a certain number of braille characters and then refresh to continue. The advantages: you can access the web, email, or other digital sources quickly and easily, including ebooks if they're well structured for use with one. But most devices are limited to a very small number of characters that can be displayed at once. Imagine the example is having to refresh the page of your Kindle or iPad every few words. Imagine doing that if you're studying for a test, and it's your geography book or your geometry book or your history book, and you're going back through it. It's challenging. It's still so much better than things were, a few decades ago, but we've got a very long way to go yet. Also, graphical content found on the web or in other digital files is not usually in an accessible format. So while the devices are a great boon, they are not providing an equivalence to mainstream ebook readers. And then there's the cost, $3,000 to $8,000. This is where you get into the total lack of economies of scale. Tactile graphics and image description. Graphical content, such as maps, math, scientific notation, geometric figures, graphs, diagrams, and illustrations, need to be represented in an alternative format to be accessible to the blind. Tactile graphics and image description are essential for conveying this content, especially in instructional materials. Haptic technologies offer the promise of digital delivery of tactile content, but this is not yet widely available, and that is not yet fully realized as an assistive technology. So here we have West Virginia, just a very simple tactile graphic. This really is a very simple tactile graphic. You can think back to some of your textbooks, and you can think about some of the charts and graphs and such that you needed to deal with, and how those might be represented. And just as a sidebar, that's one of the decisions that is made by a Braille transcriber. When they're going through the book, they're not also just translating the book into Braille. They're making decisions on, for a student, particularly if we're talking K through 12, what can be best represented by a tactile graphic, what can be best represented by what is called a transcriber note, which will convey the same information to them. And all this is also key without giving away more information than a sighted student would have in the same circumstances. I would just say as a sidebar to my sidebar, at the American Printing House for the Blind last year we were doing some work on some accessible online tests, and that was one of the real keys into whether we can make various items accessible. In order to render it accessible, were we going to be forced to give away so much information that it might seem to be an unfair advantage to the student with that information. So if such was the case, then they could not be given that question. So here's an image that's fairly complex of the carbon cycle on the screen. That probably is not going to be rendered as a tactile graphic, certainly not easily with all those elements. So here we would have a transcriber note or an image description. I won't read it to you, but it explains the carbon cycle. In this case, the person rendering this accessible determined that a table will be an appropriate format for representing some of the information in the display. And then there are 3D printers. We've used 3D printers for a very long time at the American Printing House for the Blind to make some very specific parts for some of the things that we create for people who are blind, because again, lack of economies of scale, so we have to make our own. There's been a lot of discussion about delivering representations of various images using the less expensive 3D printers. Some of them are as low as like $300 now, and that's research that we're following and participating in. But that's still early days for the 3D printers. Much of what can be produced from the low end, first of all, you have to have something, another sidebar. And I would assume that everyone knows this, but probably you don't because you're not from the same field that I am. Most people who are blind these days who are in school are not in special schools for the blind. So they're mostly in classrooms where no one else in the classroom is blind but that one student. So a teacher, and although there are teachers for the visually impaired, they typically spend a couple of hours a week with those students, teaching them Braille, mobility, how to read tactile graphics, because it's an art to learning how to read a tactile graphic as well. The ability for a teacher to be able to have a 3D printer and know what is appropriate to print out, to create as a 3D element from one of those printers that's conveying the information that the student is going to understand. I mean, that's a real challenge. And a lot of times what happens, the teacher for the visually impaired creates those tactile graphics themselves by hand now. What is obviously going to be better is if they could use a 3D printer to take away a lot of that. But they're also they're experts in teaching the visually impaired. They're not necessarily going to be experts in creating the file that is going to be needed to go to the printer to create the appropriate graph. So there's a lot of work that needs to take place here as well. But you'll see a lot about 3D printers, and they're wonderful and have great potential, but again, not there quite yet. And then there's a legal context for all of this. Accessibility has been a part of the legal landscape for many years now. The Act to Provide Books for the Adult Blind created the National Library Service in 1931. The Chafee Amendment to the Copyright Act in 1996 provides organizations such as APH, nonprofit organization that is dedicated to providing materials in accessible formats for the blind, certain categories of published materials in Braille without seeking permission, direct permission for it. Certain categories are excluded, like text, tests, for example, and many others. But that means that we don't necessarily have to come to you and ask you for permission every time a student needs a Braille textbook, which is wonderful. Now, I will say that you're going to tell me yes. I mean, who among you, if you have that, feel that you have, unless you feel you don't have the rights to give us the rights for that. Now, I have never spoken to anyone in any publishing rights office that didn't want to give us rights to produce an accessible format for a kid who's blind, right? But there's a time involved in that. Time for you at your end, time for us at our end, and what happens in our case often is it is May, June, and July, and we're getting a request for a Braille textbook for a student who's starting class August 1st. So time's very important. So Chafee Amendment, if you'd like to look it out, it's very restrictive in terms of what can be done in Braille and in what formats, but it's been very beneficial for serving that audience. There also is a whole series of state Braille laws for K through 12 that mandate what needs to be provided and in what format and to whom to help make materials accessible for in Braille for blind students. And IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 2004, has a whole section that could be an entire presentation. I could really put all of you to sleep for sure, on the National Instructional Materials Accessibility Standard and the National Instructional Materials Access Center, which is housed at the American Printing House for the Blind, which is all about getting digital files from publishers to help make these accessible formats faster on a timely basis for the students. There have also, as I'm sure you're aware, been a number of NFB lawsuits about website accessibility and the use of inaccessible devices in education. There have been major changes in the Kindle in recent years, for example. It's much more accessible than it used to be. And accessibility standards is a hodgepodge of those as well. 508, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is WCAG 2.0, EPUB 3 Best Practices, the Diagram Center Guidelines, the Association of American Publishers EPUB 3 Implementation Project Recommendations. AAP reached out to many people in the accessibility community, including APH and NFB, and many others representing people with other disabilities as well, in order to inform those recommendations. And they identified key features for publishers and reading systems to support an EPUB 3 to, again, achieve that goal of making as many materials as accessible as possible for people with disabilities, including people who are blind. Came out with 13 specific practices, and you can read all about it at this link, which I'm assuming you'll make the PowerPoint available. Good, because I'm sure none of you really want to write that down. If you go to the AAP website, it will send you over to where it's housed at the National Federation for the Blind website. And what are those top tips? Separate your content and your presentation. provide complete navigation in the form of a complete table of contents, use images only for pictures, not for tables or text or math, use image descriptions and alt text, use MathML for math content. Oh, let me go back to the $100,000 book. With MathML, was it the math in this book was contained in images? That meant some poor transcriber was going to have to sit down and key in by hand, even with a file from the publisher, every bit of the math in that textbook. That's why it was going to cost so much. Had that file been created with MathML, there are tools in development or are available now that can help translate that MathML into Braille. There'll still be work that transcribers will need to do, but MathML is very important. So I just had to pause on that because we just had this come up just recently. EduPub, that's a collaborative consortium of publishers, reader providers, online platforms, and others that are addressing key requirements for the next generation of education publishing. Structured authoring and assembly tools, the clean separation of structure and style, the need for output-ready standards to replace intermediate standards, and an open ecosystem that fosters innovation while eliminating unnecessary variations in delivery formats that provide no competitive advantage and compromise interoperability. So all of you can go back to the office and say you want to go to Oslo. June 19th is when the next EduPub meeting is, and it's going to be very helpful stuff. But again, I have to say, at APH, we've been attending the EduPub conferences, participating in them actively. Others who work in the field of blindness, such as George Kirscher. Have all of you heard of the International Digital Publishing Forum? Okay, some of you, yes, okay. Well, George Kirscher is a past president and often director of IDPF, and he's working very hard to converge the standards for accessibility for files with those used in publishing, because that, again, gets us back to what everyone, including those of us who are currently working in the field of creating accessible materials, the real, again, holy grail is for you guys actually to be able to provide as much as possible these accessible materials, and including Braille. I mean, if you want to take that on, we'd be delighted. There's always a shortage of Braille. But again, what about Braille? But despite what I said, we've not heard anything about commercial publishers moving into the Braille space. We think the size of the market has a whole lot to do with that, the complexity of the Braille code itself. APH is working on Braille Blaster, which is an open source software that will directly support Braille translation from EPUB and Anonymous, which again is that XML file that we talked about earlier, to help produce Braille. Refreshable Braille displays, the need for a full-page Braille display. We think the optimistic technical part of our company thinks that'll be there in 18 months, and I hope he's right. The tactile graphics, haptic controllers, and our full-page graphics display device. Again, the elephant and far more complex tactile graphics delivered from an electronic file to a tablet, but the tablet allows you to actually see the graphic. Again, most optimistic, 18 months out. I think that's overly optimistic, but I hope not. Additional challenges for EPUB 3, the chicken and egg development situation. What we learned is that readers, those who are producing the readers that are reading your e-books that you guys are producing, don't always support all the functionality that publishers include in their files. And in some cases, publishers are not providing content that could be helpful for those of us in the accessibility community because the readers can't render it. That's been part of the problem with MathML. Interactivity, there's a lot of discussion about video and other interactivity earlier today. Many widgets that can be used in EPUB 3 will not be accessible to readers who are blind. And the video will require captioning. So to bring it all together and to bring the presentation to close, the varying and limited accessibility of commercially available digital content, platforms, and devices make accessibility challenging for blind readers. Initiatives such as the AAP EPUB 3 implementation project and EduPub will help ensure interoperability and encourage publishers to incorporate a very high level accessibility into digital publications. However, it remains to be seen how far the market will drive accessibility and or what role legislation may have in this arena in regard to K through 12 materials. Within the accessibility community, efforts are underway to produce an affordable, full-page Braille display, while haptic technologies are in development to provide new alternatives for access to graphical content. But what we hope is that in a few years, stories like, mine from decades ago, that having to buy 2 copies of the book and wait a year to be able to read it, will never be heard again. But what we still have in the case of Braille and the complex textbooks, it can take 6 months. It can take 8 months. It depends on how complex the material is to produce the Braille. There's a lot that has to do with the code and formatting, and just, I guess, what I can say is if you can try to imagine, textbooks are so feature-rich, even in the print versions. The sidebars, the images, the graphs, the decorative motifs, the color, the italics, the bold, anything like that you include calls for extra formatting into Braille and makes a greater burden on the student in being able to actually read that as Braille. It's a lot more dots for them to get to the nub. So it's the design of textbooks is becoming more complex, or has become more complex. It will be so in the future with the learning management systems, and we appreciate the support that we received from the publishing industry in the past to help make these materials accessible as fast as possible, and look forward, I hope, to many more years of support from you guys. But again, anything that you can do to make materials accessible, our role at APH is to make materials accessible for people who are blind that they cannot acquire from the commercial field. And our president says every year, our goal is to go out of business, that everything will be accessible and right off the bat, and then there won't be a need for APH. We're not seeing that in the next few years, but we'd like to. Do you have questions for me? Yes, ma'am?
I just wanted to say thank you for what you do. I had an aunt lose her sight later in life, and a friend of mine also lost his sight about age 25. And the audio books have been just such a lifeline for them, and I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I work with a lot of 508 compliance at my job, but we never think about how children need Braille to read and write. So it was a really good perspective to hear, because I do so much with the digital that I don't think about, oh yeah, it would be really hard to understand this if I had never had the chance to get it on paper ever before. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
There's a real difference between a K-12 textbook and a higher ed textbook, because the adoption process for K-12 is generally at least every 5 years, a new version. Mm-hmm. So that $100,000 textbook, was that a K-12 math book?
It was K-12 math.
Okay. Here's what I think is going to happen in higher ed. We're going to see a faster revision cycle, not necessarily annually, but they're going to move toward an annual revision. And then you have, as you pointed out, the learning management systems. Mm-hmm. So if they revise that textbook annually in order to combat the 33 to 35% they're losing to used books and the 12 to 15% they're using to rental books, they're losing half the market. If they move to an annual, how could you possibly cope and get a new Braille book in bio, chem, physics, whatever, on an annual basis?
Well, we serve K through 12, and we do not produce, American Printing House for the Blind does not produce all the Braille that's used in K through 12 classrooms in the U.S. because of capacity issues for us alone. The other thing that I will say about K through 12, which until I took this job I didn't realize, with so many state editions, the challenge that we have is a Braille textbook that is used in one state, even if it is the same title, because of the differences that are mandated by making it state-specific, is likely going to require additional work to make it available for that student.
Common Core may help you in that area.
It may. I actually live in Indiana, which is withdrawn from Common Core already, I think officially, and some others are as well. That was part of our hope. You know, AAP several years ago had done some work to help try to provide more of a solution to higher ed. The Congress had a commission available. Our president was one of the members of that commission. But in addition, the ATN was established, the Accessible Textbook Network, which is a provisioning service of, it's based out of Georgia. ATN, I can send the link. But anyway, they provide files for accessibility purposes into the higher ed level. Disability services offices in colleges and universities where Braille is required, they're the ones who are charged with ensuring that that student receives the Braille. And it is a huge challenge in higher ed. One reason Congress steered clear of something analogous to NIMAC, which is a national repository of files to be used to produce Braille in other formats. We have like 37,000 anonymous file sets currently. It is because of the sheer scope of materials that are used in higher ed. I believe the figure quoted was somewhere around 250,000 different titles. And so, yes, producing Braille for all of those from someone like an APH, we're not going to be able to meet that need. Right? It's a So the most that can be done on the digital front to make it easier for the emerging technologies to deliver to the student, the better we're going to be able to meet those needs.
I had a question about 508 compliance. So are there committees or organizations in place that monitor the quality of that compliance with the 508 standards, or is the onus pretty much on the publisher to make sure that they're coding everything in the way that's most beneficial for people with visual impairments or suffering?
I'm sorry, but I don't know the answer to that. That's outside my my scope of knowledge.
Okay, we're gonna have one more question. Sorry that we need to cut it off.
Thank you. There was a piece in the Independent UK this week. It was very controversial. Does the digital age spell the end of Braille? And it's mostly saying that the future of is computer technology, and based on UK, they said the usage of these devices and also in their equivalent of NLS, people are using less and less. So I'm not sure what do you think about that.
I'm sorry, using less and less?
Braille in the library.
Our focus at APH, in general, I don't know whether people are using less and less Braille, because APH itself doesn't keep statistics on that, nor do we keep statistics on Braille readers in general. The whole area of Braille statistics is somewhat fraught. The World Blind Union can be a good source for some of that discussion and some of the information, which of course RNIB is a member of, as is APH. For the K through 12 population, that is actually the focus of the American Printing House for the Blind, we see Braille being challenged because it is not being taught. Sometimes questions come up. We actually, an example that I used someone today was we sometimes receive an order in not for a Braille textbook for a child, but someone wants us to create a large print version of a textbook that has like maybe a 25 or 30 or 35 font. That child, in the opinion, this is not my personal opinion because I'm not an educator of the blind, but many people would say that child should learn Braille because the ability to access information, if you have that sort of a deficit, they're requiring that kind of font and probably also additional magnification devices as well, is such that they should learn Braille. But occasionally things will emerge as they have in the U.S., and I think NFB, which is an advocacy organization for people who are blind, whereas APH is an organization we don't advocate, but we serve people who are blind, is that sometimes decisions are made where students are not being taught Braille because of a lack of understanding that Braille is necessary, a lack of understanding of what it means in terms of literacy. And when you get to statistics of readership and those who are reading Braille and those who aren't, one other significant factor can be when the individual lost their sight. Because I think, people, I don't know if it's actually true, but I've certainly heard it said often that most of us can expect to acquire some sort of disability in our life if we live long enough. It'll be a mobility disability or a cognitive disability or a visual or an auditory disability. But basically, in the foundation, when people are building their lives for education, for their independence, our statistics, some statistics I believe or show, is that people who read Braille achieve and have a better chance, again, those were the quotes from NFB, in achieving independence as part of the working community. The statistics, I can't quote them, Cornell has them, but the statistics for people who are blind and being unemployed, and we're talking about younger, educated people who, are appalling. They're well in the 80%. I don't doubt that that you would see many people who are losing their vision due to macular degeneration or something later in life deciding not to take on acquisition of Braille and not reading Braille as much. Simply because they don't want to. I mean, I certainly have anecdotal evidence of that from people that I know myself. So I think that that's probably part of the picture. So I can't give you the entire answer, but I think there are several things going on, whether Braille is being taught, whether it's understood by people who are really charged with educating people who are blind in regular schools, that Braille is essential. If you're not learning it when you're young, you're less likely, I would guess, to use it later in life. And it also will depend on what you're reading. For some reason, I have a mental block that I can never, ever remember this guy's name. But he's a physicist, an astrophysicist from UC Berkeley. And he set up the SETI program, and he was featured in Contact. The year I went to work at APH, he gave our keynote at our annual conference. And he spoke about the question about Braille and the viability of Braille in today. And he said as a physicist, he used every method available to him. Assistive technology, text-to-speech, the screen readers. But he still found that there were things that he needed to do as a physicist that required Nemeth Braille, that sometimes required him to work most effectively using embossed Braille. So I believe personally that the answer is that we need to equip these students and make available to people the accessible format Braille, which does equate to literacy, and that they have the skill set to use that, to learn how to read tactile graphics, but that they also have available to them, just as we all have, a variety of formats, and whatever they may choose for that point in their life, whatever that particular format may be, whether they would prefer to have it in a digital format, whether it's digital Braille or screen reader, whatever it may be, that they should be able to access that book, that information, under those terms. But I don't know if that helped, or did that?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.